Hello guys, my name is Chukwemeka Christian Nalwe, a third-level student of philosophy and also the vice president of NAFS. And today we'll be discussing on Introduction to Logic, page 110. It may interest you to know that logic is a branch of philosophy. Although there are controversies surrounding logic being a branch of philosophy, some scholars have argued that logic should not be treated as a branch of philosophy, but instead it should be treated as a tool of philosophy. So basically, we are still going to be taking logic as a branch of philosophy in this tutorial. So what is logic? That's what we'll start with. Just like philosophy itself, there are a lot of controversy and disagreement that surround the meaning and concept of logic. So some philosophers have defined logic in several ways, but for the sake of conceptual clarification, we'll be taking some definition of logic. So the first definition I'm going to state here is that logic is the science of reasoning. Logic is the science of reasoning. So you may ask me that if logic is the science of reasoning, then what is now psychology, since psychology also deals with reasoning? So let me clarify that controversy and disagreement that surround the whole concept of this definition of logic as the science of reasoning. So basically, logic is not interested in how the human think or how the human reason. Logic is only interested in the product of your thoughts. That is, it is whatever you've put down as your argument, as your thought, that is what logic tries to investigate into. But psychology is interested on how human beings think, what makes them think the way they think, and what have you. But that is not the subject matter of logic. The subject matter of logic is the product of your thoughts. So it's the product of your thoughts that determines what logic will look into. So there's a popular definition of logic by a scholar by name Ivan Kupi. And that definition of logic is what is mostly accepted. And the definition of logic goes thus: that logic is the study of the methods and principles used to distinguish correct from incorrect reasoning. So the name of the scholar is Ivan Kupi. He defined logic as the study of the methods and principles used to distinguish correct from incorrect reasoning. So in other words, we have reasoning that are correct, we have reasoning that are incorrect. So the help of logic, studying logic, helps us to distinguish, to discern between a reasoning that is correct and a reason that is incorrect. Take for example, if I say that Emeka is a scholar because he's in 300 level, what kind of reasoning is that? That the fact that somebody is in 300 level does not necessarily qualify the person as being a scholar. That is an incorrect reasoning. But if I say Emeka is a scholar because he's on a first-class CGPA, we definitely know that for somebody to be on a first-class CGPA, that means the person is a scholar. So these are the kind of reasoning that we have, correct and incorrect, and that is what logic helps human beings to discern. So moving on, we'll be going into the subject matter of logic. The subject matter of logic. The subject matter of logic is called argument. Now, in a layman term, we will actually see argument to be a kind of disagreement or quarrel or what have you. So basically, in logic, we do not see argument as quarrel. Instead, we see it as reason for accepting the conclusion of a particular thing. That is, if you hold a particular position or you hold a particular stance on a particular thing, a particular topic on a particular concept, you need to give us reason for accepting that your conclusion, for that your stance or whatever. So basically, if I see that Emeka is a boy, you need to give me reason for believing that Emeka is a boy. So that is what argument in logic entails. So to define arguments in logic, it simply means a set of propositions. So let's go. Lord, argument is a set of propositions. A set of propositions of which one is claimed to follow from the others. Which is regarded as the basis, or you say grounds, for accepting the truth of the very first one. I know that this is actually a long definition of what an argument is, but what this definition is basically trying to say is that an argument is just a collection of propositions. Why do you mean? So for us to have an argument, there must be two or more propositions. For example, if I say Professor Anele is a scholar, this cannot be classified as an argument because it's just a proposition. So, but if I say Professor Anele is a scholar because he is a first-class student, a first-class graduate, now we can now have an argument because this is the first proposition, Professor Anele is a scholar, and this is the second proposition, he is a first-class student. So now that we define argument as a set of propositions, what is that proposition? Or what is meant by proposition? Or what can we say proposition is? So in logic, we define proposition to be a declarative statement. That means, in other words, there are other propositions which are not declarative. For example, statement that comes in form of questions are proposition. If I ask you, what is your name? That is also a proposition. But this is not the kind of things that we use in logic. We only use declarative statements, propositions that have the declarative status. For example, if I say, Emeka is a human, that is a declarative statement because it can be true or false. So proposition in logic is that sentence which can be asserted or which can be denied. In other words, which can be affirmed or which can be denied, which can be confirmed or which can be denied. So a proposition is a declarative statement. Let me write it on the board for clarity. A proposition is a declarative statement. Declarative statement asserting a fact which can be true or false. Emeka is an angel. Is an angel. It is a proposition that have a declarative status, because this proposition can be affirmed or it can be denied. Of course, Emeka is a human because definitely I do not have the qualities of being an angel, but this statement is false because Emeka is really not an angel. So these are the kind of things we use in logic. Propositions, and this kind of proposition are declarative in nature. So that is why the meaning of proposition in logic is that a proposition is a declarative statement asserting a fact which can be true or false, which means we can say anything in logic, but we can formulate proposition in logic, but that proposition in logic must have the status of being true or false. Now, don't forget that we define argument as a set of propositions. All right? So proposition acts or functions in various ways in an argument. So we have the proposition that functions as the premise of an argument, also a proposition that functions as the conclusion of the argument. So proposition that functions as the premise of that argument. So let's start. So basically, in an argument, we have premise, we have conclusion. One important key thing to note is that even before an argument occurs, there's something in logic that is called an inference. So, what is an inference? An inference is said to be a mental process. Inference is a mental process by which a proposition is arrived and affirmed at. An inference is a mental process by which a proposition is arrived and affirmed at on the basis of other propositions which is regarded as the starting point of the process. So, how do I mean? This is grammar. Basically, what inference is trying to say here is that every inferential process leads to an argument. For example, inference is just basically you thinking about what you say. Like, I'm here teaching, right? So the next thing that I'm going to say, I'm already thinking about it. So, and that is the process of you thinking is what we call an inference. So when you think, you make propositions, you make arguments. That's what an inference is. That's why I say it is a mental process, the process of you thinking something, by which a proposition is arrived and affirmed that. So you infer proposition on the basis of other proposition. Basically, at this point I've gotten here, I've built what I'm saying basically based on the time I started teaching. So this is inference. It is progressive. It's built on proposition statement from one statement to the other, but it all entails mental process. So that's what an inference is. Now, what is a premise? Let's go back to this. In an argument, a premise is a proposition. Don't forget that I said that an argument is a set of propositions, and those propositions can function in two different ways in an argument. We have the propositions that function as the premise of the argument. We also have propositions that function as the conclusion of the argument. So the proposition that function as the premise, that is what we want to look at to actually know the meaning of premise. So a premise is a proposition, or you can say premises, depending. A premise is a proposition which gives, or let's put it this way, premise is a proposition that serves as the reason for accepting the conclusion of an argument. That's the reason for accepting the conclusion of an argument. All right, why conclusion? A conclusion is the proposition that is accepted on the basis of other propositions. So it is worthy to note that in an argument, we can have just one premise and we can have two premises, or we can have multiple premises, but there must only be just a conclusion in an argument. In other words, we can have as many premises as possible, but it can only be one conclusion in an argument. So that is why conclusion is defined as the proposition that is accepted on the basis of other proposition or propositions. So this S should be in bracket, proposition or propositions. So, for example, let's assume that I say this. Let's say Emeka is a scholar because he is on a first class CGPA. Now, as far as logic is concerned, this is an argument, all right? Because we have proposition here. Emeka is a scholar, is a proposition, right? It can be affirmed or it can be denied. If he's on a first class CGPA, it can be affirmed or it can as well be denied. So, but you ask me that how do I distinguish, or how do I differentiate the premise of this argument from the conclusion of this argument? That is why in logic, to help us, logicians have been able to invent premise indicators and conclusion indicators. So examples of premise indicators. So let's give some example of premise indicators. Example of premise indicators, we have because, all right? We have since, we have for, we have it follows from. So, and these premise indicators are usually prefixed before the premise. For example, look at this example I've given. Emeka is a scholar because he's on a first class CGPA. Now, because, don't forget I say that premise indicators are usually prefixed. That means it comes before the premise. So, because he is on a first class CGPA, because of the premise indicator, because, so this whole proposition is on a first class GPA have become our premise. So this Emeka is a scholar have become the conclusion. It's worthy to note that sometimes in an argument, the premise indicator will be given and the conclusion indicator will not be given. And sometimes the conclusion indicator will be given and the premise will not be given. But whenever you're able to discern or differentiate, whenever you see a premise indicator, it's usually prefixed before the premise. For example, I'm going to give you an example of an argument that the conclusion will be given, the conclusion indicators will be given, and the premise indicators will not be given. So before that, let's look at conclusion indicators. So we have conclusion indicators. Conclusion indicators, we have so, therefore, hence, consequently, it follows that. Sometimes students of logic often confuse it follows from and it follows that. It follows from, please note, is a premise indicator. It follows that is a conclusion indicator. Now, since we've been given an example of conclusion indicators, I'm going to make an example of an argument where the conclusion indicators will be given and the premise indicators will not be given. So, following this same example, let me say, so, Emeka is a first class student. Emeka is a first class student. Therefore, he is a scholar. Emeka is a first class student, therefore is a scholar. So if you look at this argument that I've given here, Emeka is a first class student, therefore is a scholar. You can see that the conclusion indicator is given, but the premise indicator is not given. So in an argument, the premise can come first and the conclusion can also come first. So it doesn't matter. What you should take note is the presence of the indicators, or the presence of the premise indicators and the presence of the conclusion indicator. So therefore, is a scholar, therefore is a scholar is the conclusion. Emeka is a first-class student, is the premise. Why? Because the conclusion indicator is already prefixed before this proposition, he is a scholar. So take note. And sometimes, but we will not have a case where both the premise indicators and the conclusion indicators will not be given. So the premise indicators can be given and the conclusion indicators will not be given. All right, or the conclusion indicators be given and the premise indicator will not be given. But so far as you've been able to identify a premise indicator in an argument, know that the rest is the conclusion. And if you have identified the conclusion indicator in an argument, know that the rest is premise. All right, guys, we've come to the end of this session. Please, if you have any questions, kindly drop them on the comment section below. Thank you very much.